Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff, along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Well, we're pleased to welcome immigration attorney and longtime Ayn Rand fan Michael Niren to the show. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely. We wanted to talk with you about this concept we've been working through about blurred distinctions within some of Rand's ideas or equivocations that maybe have caused confusion in the movement. And we'll talk through some examples, but I'd like to just start with a little bit of your origin story, maybe how you got into Rand.
Yeah, for sure. So way back in the 80s, I read Atlas Shrugged at the urging from my girlfriend, my then girlfriend at the time, who read Atlas Shrugged and said I would love it. And I was still in high school, a senior in Canada. And so what ended up happening is I read the book and I was hooked immediately. And I loved it. And I thought that, hey, I'm going to take philosophy in university. So I ended up majoring in philosophy, and because I loved the material, and I loved Atlas Shrugged. And second year, I think it was, I had a professor, the late John Ridpath, who was an objectivist, a well-known objectivist, and he was one of my profs at York University in Toronto. And, I loved his course. It was on intellectual history, and I got to know him personally. And he had this study group that he formed, a private study group for people who are interested in Ayn Rand's ideas, and took Ayn Rand's ideas seriously, and held the group at his condo in Toronto once a week. And we'd all go there and have dinner with him at his beautiful condo, and we discuss OPAR. It was an OPAR study group, and it'd be a once a week thing with other fellow students and John. And I learned a ton, and I also read OPAR, and I began reading Ayn Rand's nonfiction work, and I graduated with a degree in philosophy, and then went to law school afterwards. But I've always retained a deep interest in objectivism and Ayn Rand for the last 30 years. And I've attended some conferences and things like that, and chatted with people like you guys over social media, and always kept a keen interest.
That's great. Did you go to that school because Ridpath was a professor there? No,
actually, it was just one of the major universities in Toronto at the time. And I didn't know even Ridpath. I don't think I even knew who Ridpath was when I enrolled. But then, because I was so interested in Ayn Rand, I was scanning the syllabus and the various courses, and at that time, second year, I knew who Ridpath was, and I saw, oh wow, he's a professor, and I obviously took his course for that reason.
Sure. Thoughts? Now, you actually immigrated from Canada to the US, kind of using your own services. Any just general thoughts on Canada versus the US over the years?
Well, I mean, we share a lot of culture, and when people say when the US catches when the US sneezes, Canada catches a cold. So we get all your shows and your a lot of Canadian actors, and you know them all, who've now live in Hollywood. There's a lot of cross-border cultural similarities. But having said that, living in the US now for 8 years, there's definitely a difference. And Ayn Rand used to talk about the American sense of life. And I never really understood it as distinct from how Canadians were, because we share a border, we're so close culturally. But there is a difference, and it's encapsulated in, I would say, the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the famous statement, versus the Canadian mantra, constitutional mantra, which is peace, order, and good government. Now, that's a completely different sentiment. Peace, order, and good government is a Canadian constitutional sentiment. And it kind of, that's, back in the, 1800s and 1700s, but that permeates, that psychology is permeated through the Canadian psyche versus the American psyche, which is life living in pursuit of happiness. And Americans generally are more, aggressive, but not in a good way, and more like demanding of their own, self-interest and passion of pursuing their dreams and expectations that, this is my life, this is what I want to do. And I mean, obviously not every American shares that perspective,
Right.
unfortunately, but Canadians are just more compliant, more obedient, more believing that the government plays a role in their life. And to illustrate this is more than anything is during the COVID pandemic. I mean, the contrasting behaviors between the two countries is so glaring. And of course, not everyone in Canada and America is uniformly behaves in a uniform way. Everyone's different, but there is a big contrast between the two countries. There was.
When you were when you were studying under John Ridpath, did some of that Canadian influence affect the way objectivism was taught, do you think, in Canada?
I don't think so. I mean, the way Ridpath is passionate objectivist, and wow, I mean, he's a Canadian-born guy, and he has a cottage up north. He had a cottage up north. We use the word cottage. I'm not sure what you guys call it, but like a kind of
cabin.
Yeah, way up north. And he was a real like outdoorsman, a Canadian outdoorsman. And his family, owned a furniture store, a very well-known furniture store in Toronto. So he's a lot of Canadian roots. So he's a real Canadian guy. But man, he's an American by spirit, and by his whole approach to life was as American as it comes. And the way in which he taught objectivism was wonderful. He didn't teach objectivism just to be technical here. It's more intellectual history, obviously from an objectivist perspective. And he taught the great thinkers from the Greeks all the way to the German idealists to the Romantic, the Renaissance thinkers, and obviously Ayn Rand. He taught it with passion, and he was a very, very passionate guy. So no, I don't think there's a Canadian kind of influence. Look, objectivism and Americanism is not Canadianism. Like, let's just call it say what it is.
Right. And there were a lot of Canadians from Peikoff on down that ended up having a big influence on the movement.
Yeah, I mean, like Brandon, Nathaniel Brandon, Leonard Peikoff, John Ridpath. There's some friends of mine who moved to Irvine, California, to join ARI from Toronto. There's a lot of Torontonians and Canadians who've, are objectivists.
Yeah, I think maybe Onkar was from Canada.
He is, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so well, that's fascinating stuff. I do want to jump to what we were talking about, the blurred distinctions within the movement, and just get maybe some of your help in unpacking this. And we talked a little bit about this, but I think there's a problem in grasping or applying certain concepts within the objectivist movement where there's certain distinctions that are not clear. I mean, a friend of mine talked about it as being equivocation, which may be a better way to describe it. But one of the early examples that came up was in our analysis of It's a Wonderful Life. And, we looked at it and saw George Bailey as benevolent, but, Yaron and many at ARI see him as an altruist that, gave up his values. So, that's one of the first ones that altruism versus benevolence. And even Rand's definition of selfishness itself, has been a source of confusion for people that don't mean it the way she meant it.
Yeah, well, look, let's start with the acknowledgement that objectivism is a radical philosophy, and it's more radical than most people grasp, including libertarians and conservatives. are those who, you know, are quote unquote, pro liberty, pro capitalism. They see objectivism as, yeah, maybe an alternative point of view to what they believe, and maybe, you know, there's a lot of commonalities. But when you take a deep dive into, you know, the concepts and the philosophical framework, it's completely different. It is completely different, and and this is why it's so hard to really, you know, sink your teeth into objectivism and really appreciate it. And it's very easy to dismiss as radical and you know, not the kind of philosophy you want to put forward to advocate for common goals. So libertarians and conservatives, you know, it could be argued on some level, at least on a political level, that there are some common denominators, you know, limited government, liberty, you know, freedom of speech and all that. But when you really take a deep dive and you go, you know, to the epistemological, metaphysical levels, which really are the foundations of objectivism, there's, you know, strong, diametrically opposed disagreements. So words like selfishness, well, that would offend automatically the average conservative. It would offend the average libertarian, and would offend any leftist, or not even, like, you know, forget
basically 99% of the electorate.
99.9% of people. And Ayn Rand goes ahead and writes a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. Now, talk about a contradictory title from 99% of people's perspective. That's a heavy lift.
Yeah.
You're going to convince someone of, you know, the morality, the ethics, which is, like, you know, a pillar and probably the most revolutionary of all her philosophical, you know, ideas of objectivism. And if you don't buy into the ethics, it's really tough to say you're an objectivist. I mean, that's a core. How the hell are you going to convince the man on the street, the average person, that selfishness is virtuous? I mean, it's a tautology. It's like saying water is wet when you know, selfishness is evil. They're synonymous now. Why they're synonymous? Because of 2,000 years of history. So how do you, Ayn Rand's going against 2,000 years of history. So it is tough. It is tough. It's a heavy lift. And that's the problem with disseminating objectivism and convincing others, because you are really going against the ethical grain of the last 2,000 years.
You know, there's this concept called triggering. You know, the right loves to trigger the left emotionally. I think that in some respects, objectivist rhetoric is aimed at triggering the right, and sometimes the left as well, but especially when they're talking about selfishness being a virtue, that seems to trigger the right in an emotional way. They have a visceral reaction to it, and they say, how, that's dumb. How can you, you know, they start calling you names, and they start thinking you're an idiot. It's really just an emotional reaction to what you're saying to them. So I'm not sure if there's great value in that rhetorical tactic or not. That's kind of a question that's up in the air for me. Is it? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's totally a valid point. And I think, you know, what Rand means is not the conventional view of selfishness. Clearly, selfishness is, you know, in the conventional view, is like the Hollywood version, where you have this evil, you know, business owner who's trying to screw his employees and harm his customers to achieve maximum profit. That's in the economic realm. In the personal realm, the selfish person is the one who just, like, well, you know, screw his best friend, you know, in order to, you know, gain some benefit and harm others. Or even in the criminal context, you know, a selfish person is a robber who will just steal someone else's money at gunpoint. Well, that person's being selfish, and it's evil, and it's wrong. So that is the conventional view of selfishness. And that 99% of people would agree with and say that's wrong. I would say it's wrong, but that's not Rand's view. Rand made it clear. It's rational self-interest is implicit, a term, and again, that's epistemological, rational. So that she has, again, it's a loaded term that has a specific meaning. It's very, very difficult to explain, hey, wait a second, it's not the conventional view of selfishness. The conventional view of selfishness, in fact, in Rand's view, is sacrifice. So, my God, it's not easy. It's not easy.
And sacrifice is another one of those concepts that, for people in the military that, may look at it as, someone in their family died fighting for the country. And, we're supposed to be telling them, oh, no, that wasn't actually a sacrifice.
That's right. That's right. And that's like offensive to people in the service. But then you go back and you say, who said declared the famous statement, give me freedom or give me death? Who was that historically? Can't remember.
Patrick Henry.
Patrick Henry. Okay. Well, that's a great example, because that's Rand or an objectivist would resonate very strongly. And it does resonate with me. Give me freedom or give me death. I, love my life. And my life means flourishing, means making my own choices and and doing what I want to do for my own sake and and those I value. And that really makes a lot of sense. And that should resonate. That's not just abstract. What do people in North Korea do? They risk their lives, literally, and their lives of their family to try to escape tyranny. They'll do horrible things to try to get out of tyranny. Give me freedom or give me death. They will face death in the face to live in freedom. So that is not just some abstract, historical concept. That's real. And I guess that is very, very selfish, right? Because people are doing it for themselves and for those they love, who they value. Right. So Rand is right. Like, Rand is right about all this. It's just the challenge, in my view, is to try to, frame it in a way that people have an aha moment and go, oh my God, you're right. I see what you mean by selfishness is virtuous. I see what you mean by, someone fighting, let's say in war and at great risk for themselves. It's really not a sacrifice. It's an act of extreme selfishness, but it sounds so hard. It's so hard to digest that, but you have to couch it in its proper context. That's the challenge.
I think that one of the issues also is, like, how much time do you have to present your case? So when Rand titles her book, The Virtue of Selfishness, that's the first thing a reader will see. And so that's the triggering line. But if you read the book, then she explains it and it becomes clear what she means. But so in terms of using the language and making an argument, the title of your book be The Virtue of Selfishness, or should it be something else like altruism is bad, or some sort of lesser triggering word like self-interest? Like, a lot of objectivists, they shy away from the word selfishness and they use rational egoism or rational self-interest, something like that. So maybe you begin with that and then you form this chain of logic leading up to your argument that selfishness is really good.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think the intellectuals do that. I mean, Ayn Rand she was more polemic. She was an author. And, she was a great, she didn't do it intentionally, but she was a great marketer. And in a way, the virtue of selfishness is like what we would say today is clickbait. It's very controversial. It's very shocking to read a title like that, The Virtue of Selfishness. So in a way, it's captivating. And counterintuitively, it may will sell a lot more. Sells a lot more books than altruism is immoral. The title of, but in the intellectual context, when you are trying to really have a serious dialogue with someone who has an open mind and is interested in learning an alternative point of view and questioning his or her premises, I agree with you. You can't just like open with like, you know, it's like the moral case for fossil fuels, like Alex Epstein, right? It's like fossil fuels now, like 99% of people, once again, think fossil fuels is bad. You know, and he is like facing, you know, in the context of energy, what Ayn Rand dealt with in the context of morality. It's the same kind of thing where these terms are just so well entrenched and accepted by osmosis by millions of people, and these equivocations that, you know, fossil fuel is bad, you know, selfishness is bad, you know, and capitalism is bad. So it's like objectivism goes completely against the grain of everything. It's just,
Yeah.
it's a hard slog, right? So
Yeah,
Now, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to make a small point. I think that there could be an argument for using the triggering rhetoric. It might depend on like what audience you're going after. If you're going after a more rational audience and you're trying to develop you know, a movement of the most rational people, then they're less likely to be triggered by such a radical statement. They'll look at it with curiosity and they'll be like, oh, that's interesting. I've never heard that said before. Let me investigate, right? But then people who are less intellectual and less interested in logic and things like that, they'll get all emotional and go on a rant about it. But so maybe there is some sort of strategy to using that inflammatory language at first.
yeah, I think, and that illustrates the different approaches by, you know, the various objectivist organizations. So you take, you know, the Atlas Society, and they post memes all the time, you know, quick, like kind of fun, you know, one-line memes. And so there's many roads to the same destination. So they've taken that path where they're not really addressing, you know, the intellectual audience. They're really like just pointing out, you know, stuff that the average, you know, pseudo-intellect, semi-intellect, I shouldn't say pseudo, but semi-intellectual person who maybe not has the deepest understanding of philosophy would you know, understand, and it would resonate with them.
Which happens to be a broader market.
Much broader market, right? Much broader. And I don't know their social media stats, but you're 100% right. It's a lot like Turning Point USA, you know. So it reminds me of like, you know, Charlie Kirk. I don't know if he still runs it. His page where like they have these memes about, you know, the really quick, digestible, fun memes. And then ARI is much more intellectual, and it appeals to people who, you know, are just, you know, I think either I don't think it's very. It appeals to people. I think it appeals to objectivists, to be honest with you, because they, you know, the stuff that's presented, you know, through, you know, whether it's essays or even videos, I listen to them. I'm not talking really about Yarn Brooks so much, but Onkar stuff and who's the other guy? He hosts. Greg.
Oh, Harry Binswanger.
Yeah.
Oh, and Ben Bayer.
Right. That's more, it's not meant to be so entertaining. It's not meant to be, but it's more intellectual. It's just much more intellectual. And there has to be a level of understanding in advance for the audience. And I don't know if it's there to persuade anybody, but rather just to clarify maybe some finer points in objectivism. But is it making a dent towards changing minds or enlightening minds? I don't know. Like, I mean, maybe maybe the Ayn Rand contest, you know, the Ayn Rand essay contest certainly does, but I don't know. But
right. General. But I mean, that's like they've been doing that for 40 years.
Yeah, correct. So I don't know.
They have a two-pronged strategy at least. There's the outreach to the non-objectivists, like the high school students and the college students. And then there's the OAC, their educational programs where once they reach these people who are interested in objectivism, then they try to train them to be intellectuals. So I think they do have a two-pronged approach. It might just be a question of, you know, are they using the proper strategies to teach people, the philosophy. I think.
Well, yeah, you're right. But I mean, to contrast what they're doing with, let's say, Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, who are just, kind of one-man show. I mean, Ben Shapiro now has the Daily Wire, which is becoming a big thing.
Yeah, the razors.
Yeah, the Razors, they're producing movies. I mean, it's pretty impressive what he's built. I mean, I'm sure he didn't do it alone, but
He kind of has a built-in audience already, though. I mean, he's flying on the back of religion, so it's kind of hard to compete with that.
Well, I don't see he's religious. He's a religious guy. I mean, he's an Orthodox Jew, but he doesn't. That's not front and center in terms of his messaging is more political. It's like 99% political, a little bit ethical, but mostly political. Jordan Peterson is more philosophical. He's also has a religious bent as well, Christianity as well, but that's not his main message. It's more political / philosophical. But why did these two guys catch fire in a popular way? Whereas, Ayn Rand herself caught fire back in the 60s. She, her books, were huge, and she's a famous figure. But why is it that there's no one, and this is the question I've asked, and I keep asking, there's no objectivist who's catching fire? Like a single objectivist who's like, maybe Alex Epstein's the closest thing in his, but his industry is very, narrow in scope. So, amongst that in people, he's getting notoriety, but why isn't like Jordan Peterson, is he the most charismatic man on the planet? He is.
I attribute him somewhat to moral bravery. I mean, he kind of got famous for refusing to back down on pronouns.
Yeah, I know, but that kickstarted him. But how did he maintain it?
I think that's an important point that Scott made, is that he dealt with a hot topic and he took what was considered to be the most rational view. I mean, why should pronouns be forced on you? You shouldn't have to be forced to say certain pronouns. That's ridiculous. He was
brave in a very understated, academic, intellectual way. And I think that
if
resonated and made them want to hear what else he had.
But yeah, there's these flames. They flame out. They get popular. They hit a nerve, and he hit a nerve, obviously. And he was like being, surrounded by these students, and he was standing up to them at University of Toronto. But that's obviously, how did he sustain that flame? He wrote books. He was on the lecture circuit. He continued to be this very, very engaging, populist, thinker that everyone now knows who he is. And he's extremely influential, as is Ben Shapiro, who started off with these videos when he was like, such a kid. And he sustained his popularity, grew it. He built a business around it, and so did Jordan Peterson. They both built a business around it with little funding. They don't have a whole nonprofit organization like ARI. I'm not here to criticize ARI so much, but why can't, there's only one Ayn Rand. I understand that, but right. Why can't we, as objectivists, find someone or some, path to true popularity, to true impact? And it's been like, I've been interested in objectivism for 30 years, and certainly, the movement has grown. There's a lot more people I interact with. Maybe it's just my age who are into objectivism, because when I was young, no one knew about it. But still, I don't have an answer to this question. Why can't it catch fire? Maybe it's because of how radical it is. I don't know.
Well, personally, I think there are. So first of all, it's a philosophy that was developed many, many decades ago. So it's if you're trying to apply Rand's ideas to events today, that's one thing. You can try to do that, but sometimes the philosophy doesn't fit, and you can't really apply some one line Rand said about lockdowns, yeah. Vaccines or lockdowns, and turn that into a whole argument against lockdowns today. So it's the philosophy is limited to what Ayn Rand said. But if you're a Jordan Peterson or a Ben Shapiro, you're speaking for your own philosophy. They have their own views, they have their own whole philosophy, and they're developing their arguments today. And so people respect that. They respect them as the originators of a view. So there's a certain element of originality to that, I think, and people respond to that.
Interesting. So if Ayn Rand was, here today, or she was, say born later in life, you're saying, and, use the more modern terminology and dealt with more modern issues, it's conceivable that she would be, as popular as a Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro is today, because she's an originator, and it's the originators who really get the credit. It's not those who promote ideas, but rather the originators of the ideas. That's an interesting point.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. Just to take a slightly different point, I think that it was very important to her, for example, that, it not turn out like Aristotelianism, where people were calling themselves Aristotelian that really weren't. But you can micromanage that process, and we debate the open closed thing, but really part of the closed thing is that it created a scenario where people didn't feel like they could add or build onto it as much. And so you didn't have those, necessarily bold next generation leaders.
That's an interesting point. Whether or not, you're a believer that it's a closed or open philosophy, I think there is some chilling effect on those who see it as a closed philosophy. And I'm not, I have to think about it in more detail personally. But what I mean by a chilling effect, and I'm saying I'm not blaming the view that the closed philosophy is right or wrong, but those who subscribe to it could have, it may have encouraged them, rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly, to self-censor themselves, to feel that, wait, I can't say what I think, or before I apply a particular concept to a new context, I better check with the authorities as to whether or not, I'm in line. And that's,
Exactly.
I mean, that's a contradiction, or Ayn Rand always argued against argument by authority, which is a logical fallacy, argument by authority. But some of these people who may be, very, very intimidated by this closed point of view, unjustifiably, are self-censoring, and that could have some impact on disseminating her ideas. But I do challenge the idea of this original thinker concept, because why is it then that Immanuel Kant's ideas of altruism and many other ideas, just of self-sacrifice, these Marxism, well, let's, for God's sakes, these dudes have been dead for hundreds of years, yet their ideas resonate and are integrated and are completely everywhere. But yet these original thinkers, so to speak, are long gone, but yet they're so ingrained in our culture. So why is it that objectivism, after 50 years or wherever, still hasn't had liftoff? I'm not talking about necessarily replacing, Immanuel Kant and German idealism or whatever yet, but I just don't feel like it even has liftoff, and I just don't know why. I don't know why. I don't have an answer to that. I'm just asking the question.
Well, I don't have a great answer either, but I do think there are some mistakes that Rand made. And I think that until we acknowledge them and correct them in our own philosophies, there won't be that liftoff. First of all, objectivism proclaims to be focused, oriented on the facts and evidence and truth and science. And so it can't be wrong. But if your philosophy is centered around some mystical belief or supernatural belief or collectivist belief, then pretty much anything goes, and you don't have to rely on evidence or facts. You can just rely on like rationalistic logic.
Yeah, is that a fault of objectivism, or just like the fact that those philosophies are floating, we'll call, how she calls the word floating abstractions, that, and because of that, anything goes, and it's very easy just to convince people of them by, all they have to do is evade and suspend, rational thought and just have faith and believe. And because of that, it's just easier to convince people en masse. I mean, and that's a good argument, because look at, religion, look at collectivism. It's just, it's so widely adopted. It's almost universally adopted. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm saying that most people are not serious intellectuals. And so they can just follow whatever philosophy someone comes up with, or whatever religion someone comes up with, as long as it resonates with their sense of life or their emotional views. But if you're a serious scientific person and you're looking at objectivism, you're going to pick it apart. You're going to look at all its little flaws. You're going to find out where it's weak, where there are holes in the argument. And so objectivism is under serious scrutiny by serious people.
Yeah.
And so it has to be rock solid. And if it's not, if there are mistakes, you're not going to get that liftoff. You're not going to get just massive amounts of people accepting it, because you won't get massive amounts of intellectuals accepting it.
Well,
And
yeah, go ahead.
I'm suggesting that it's the blurred distinctions that are playing at least some role in that.
I think so too. Yeah, there are problems with I see it as, you call it blurred distinctions. I think of it more as like conflating two different ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's one within the objectivist world: compromise. There's moral versus political compromise. And yes, I mean, Howard Rourke is admirable for never wanting to compromise on his buildings. But I mean, at some point, so that we're not just insular and, tapped away from the rest of the world we find too imperfect. There is a place for actually working with people and I think too many objectivists, in not wanting to compromise, they're not making actually reasonable compromises that aren't selling out.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the big problems and solutions is Ayn Rand is primarily, and by her own words, is an author, a writer, not a philosopher. She never even, she said she obviously acknowledged that she created her own philosophy, but she's first and foremost an author. And her characters are characters in a novel, and they behave in certain ways. And she's a romantic realist. I mean, that's the kind of writer she is, like Victor Hugo. And these are idealists. They're all idealists, either good guys or bad guys, black and white, evil and moral. But in real life, life is messy.
Right.
And it's not a mirror of her art. And nor did she's not a naturalist. She didn't want to mirror life. She wanted to idealize life and stylize life. The problem is we are all human beings. If you are a subscriber to her philosophy, you're not going to be John Galt, you're not going to be Hank Reardon, you're not going to be Francisco, you're not going to be Howard Rourke, because they are characters in a novel. And you don't live in a stylized world. You live in reality. So those who are trying to mimic these characters, like you're saying, and acting, well, I'm not going to compromise, and walk around like rationalistic characters. And her characters, I'm not saying are rationalistic, but they are stylized. They're ideals. She wants to write about the ideal man. Okay, so you're 100% right. If you behave in that way, you're not behaving in reality. You're trying to behave as if you're a character in a novel. And I think you're right. I think people they conflate Ayn Rand's characters and her stylized approach with her actual philosophy, which is not the same. They're not the same.
Yeah. So there are different levels of compromise, I think, and I'm not even sure I'd use that word to describe what I think as just doing what you need to do to live the best life possible. And so there are political principles, there are ethical principles, there are epistemological principles. And if you, let's say, don't pursue the ideal political principle, like, capitalism, where there's no public property and everything's free trade and the government can't tax you involuntarily. If that's your goal right now and that's what you're pursuing, you're probably going to be defeated. You're not going to get very far.
It takes incremental steps to get there.
Yeah, you need to be able to work with people who are kind of on that path generally, like the liberty movement. Maybe they're trying to fight for less taxes, right? So you work with them, and that's the road to no involuntary taxes. But you can't just not work with the less taxes people because they're not for no taxes.
Zero. Yeah.
Well, it's funny. I just draw the line on moral grounds. Like, if there's a lot of great people who are not objectivists, who have no idea,
Right.
no understanding of laissez-faire capitalism is the moral social system, because they just haven't integrated that. And there's a hell of a lot of integration to get to that conclusion. But there's a lot of great people who maybe believe in a mixed economy, maybe believe in some government involvement beyond the limited scope that objectivism subscribes to. But should you not engage with these people? I think I say no. The line that I draw is: are you intellectually honest? Are you an evader, someone who just will throw out facts or arguments because it doesn't feel right and dismiss it offhand? Or have the courage to say, wait a second, this is challenging. I don't agree with it, but let me think about it. Let's discuss. That is the kind of person I don't care, if they, and then on the contrary, you get those who will say, I'm for laissez-faire capitalism, virtue of selfishness, all the reason, but they're not great people. They'll just tout these ideas. I'd rather not engage with them. So to me, it's like the standard is, are you a moral, ethical person? And what I mean by that, are you a rational person? Are you honest? Are you courageous? Will you keep your word? All that, the seven virtues as outlined in Objectivism.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you're an objectivist. It means that you're virtuous. To be an objectivist is someone to really understand and agree with Ayn Rand's ideas. It doesn't mean that it doesn't equate with being a moral person.
That's right.
You can argue that if you truly are an objectivist, that means you're a moral person, but being a moral person does not mean you're an objectivist.
I've seen people claim to be objectivists and moral people that I didn't think were moral.
Yeah, me too.
Well, we definitely have to separate the two. You can be a moral person and you're not necessarily an objectivist.
100%, but some people would disagree with that. Some people would say that unless you explicitly hold all these ideas, and to argue against that is very easy. I mean, look at Ayn Rand's characters in her novels. Hank Rearden, only at the very last chapter, or very close to the last chapter or section of her book, became, really was enlightened.
Right.
He was always from day one of a moral person, but he certainly didn't understand, even forget capitalism. He didn't understand even ethics. He was confused about sacrifice and selfishness and suffered for it. Would you say he is an immoral person? No objectivist would dare say that. But yet he was not selfish. He wasn't. He tried to be, but he was messed up because he wasn't clear. So why not engage libertarians? Why not engage conservatives? Why not engage even liberals? I would. They all could be great.
Yeah, I can't. I agree with you fully. I think, part of the issue is we get accused of sanction and tolerance. Those are some other ones. I mean, there's a difference between moral tolerance and civil tolerance.
Yep.
Um,
You know,
Go ahead.
this is the problem I try to deal with is we live in a culture that I see it primarily as having a bad morality or bad ethics. So how do you deal with living in a society that doesn't value honesty the way objectivists do, or doesn't value productivity the way objectivists do? Is there some room there to work with people who maybe they are evaders in certain areas of their life, and maybe they're not always honest with themselves or honest with you? And can you deal with that? Can you still deal with them if they show some sort of interest in your ideas or interest in your goals or your philosophy? Like a lot of conservatives, they're very sympathetic to Rand's ideas. But then on the other hand, when it comes to religion, you can see they just blank out, and they just, they don't listen to what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be, mindful of your own, objectives in engaging with anybody, whether it be in business or intellectual discourse or personal relationships, friendships. Most people are mixed. In other words, they have mixed premises. They don't have a fully integrated. That's the thing about objectivism. If you really understand, if you really grasp it, you fully integrated it. It's a fully integrated perspective where everything kind of connects. Most people are disintegrated. They have some, positive ideas, but in other areas of their life, they're quite irrational or evasive. And the question is, can you deal with these people? And I think the answer is yes, depending upon the degree of their rationality and the context. So in business, for example, if I'm dealing with someone, they could be very religious, or they could be, politically leftist or whatever. But if they, in the context of working with them, they're honest, they meet their obligations under a contract, they do what they say they're going to do, they have certain skills. I have no hesitancy whatsoever, because it's a limited context. Would I be their best friend? Would I, the answer is no. So I mean, we throw the word context around. Objectivists love that word, but it is helpful. And I think depending upon your objectives with engaging in people who are mixed, you have to define what your objective is, and then limit it in scope. Why? To protect your own interests. Because if you open your heart and mind to anybody, you're going to get burned. You're just going to get burned, and you don't want that. So that's how I approach it. And it's very tough because people don't always show their cards, and then you find out, shit, this person is not who I thought they were. And then, you can get in trouble. But that's part of the risk of dealing with people, rational or
Sure,
not.
any relationship.
Yeah.
I like to use the criteria of, are they generally going in the right direction? Are they trying to be more rational than they were? And that's not to say, you're still not going to get burned. Sometimes it can move 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or even the opposite. But I'm just looking for people that are trying to be more rational and go in the right direction, and that at least gives me something to build on. And it's a moving context. It changes. If they keep getting more rational, it's going to enhance my relationship with them. If they do something crazy, it's going to, make me more distant.
You learn as you go. You gain evidence of people as you interact with them, and the evidence could, be positive or negative, and it's incumbent on you to act accordingly. So as you develop a relationship with someone, you learn more and more about them. But if the evidence is mounting that this is not really a good person, this person is not going to serve your interests, then you have to, cut ties or at least reduce your interaction with that person accordingly. And if you don't, that's on you. And alternatively, this person could be, surprisingly more rational and beneficial to you than you originally thought. and you maybe were going to write them off. But now you're thanking yourself for not writing them off, and you're giving them a chance because, hey, it turns out that this person is a better person and more valuable to you than you originally thought. So I think people are complicated. They're not like goods and services where you just kind of like, yeah, this is something I like, this is something I don't like. People are really complicated, and it's very difficult to judge and to know whether someone is a plus or a minus until, you know, some time has passed. And I've learned that the hard way, man. Oh, in business, you know, I get very excited about engaging with certain people. The resume is amazing. And I've gotten really burned because of that when you're too hasty.
So we've been talking
Sure.
about dealing with individuals and trying to determine whether they're worth working with. But what about groups? Is and this is where we get into the politics between the left and the right, is we're trying to decide, should we go with the right or the Republicans or the left or the Democrats? How do you judge which group you should go with and which group you should, you know, vote with or organize with or have conferences with?
It's a great question. I think it's the same principle, but applied in a different context again. So you got to be able to know enough about the group and their activities and the key players. And that's really, what do they do? You know, what kind of activities do they undertake, and who are the drivers? So you kind of have to, I mean, it depends on how deep of a dive and how involved you want to be. Are you a donor? Are you a co-speaker? Do you go to their conferences, or are you just like, you know, a friend them on Facebook in a casual way? So that's, you know, it depends on your level of interaction. If you're a donor, you're actually, you know, giving true value to these people. So and this is money that you've earned. So you better well know who the drivers of this organization are and what activities they're performing. Are the activities meeting your objectives, your political objectives? Like if you want to see a world of freedom and liberty, are they moving towards that end? And who are the people driving the boat? And if they are not who you think they are, or they're not doing what you want them to do, okay, friend them on Facebook maybe, but that's about it. And who do you align yourself with? That's a tough one. Most of these movements, in my view, I just stay clear. I mean, because I think they're going in the complete wrong direction. So I don't align myself, but not to say, and I won't interact with any given individual in the movement, but to say I endorse this movement, I'm a participant in them. I can't think of, it's very tough, very tough.
That's all right. I use the term Ayn Rand fan instead of objectivist.
I guess you have to broaden the category at some point. Like you could be so there are religious conservatives, and then there are traditional conservatives, and I guess economic conservatives, whatever they call free market conservatives. So you don't have to be, you can be in the broader political movement or group or organization, and you don't have to be tied to a specific wing of it, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking that we should, because I hate the left so much, I think we should join the right, or the Republicans at least, and become a wing of the Republican Party. I think that would be more effective than trying to do like a third party thing.
Well, it's a political discussion on the political level. I don't know. I mean, there are those who want to start the capitalist party, but I think, you know, libertarian.
We had Mark Pellegrino on. He did that.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. Well, the libertarians can't even get lift off, which is an official party. It's a third party, right? And you know, they run for president. They can't get lift off. They can't get more than 2%, or even, I don't even know what percentage. So who's to think that a capital? I mean, no offense to your guest, but to say that, you know, to start a capitalist party, not in our lifetime, guys, it's not going to happen. I think we know that there's not going to be a true capitalist party that's going to win an election in our lifetime. I wish I don't think so. I mean, look, no one has a crystal ball, but if you're.
But it seems like the liberty caucus is becoming one of the more important branches of the House caucuses.
But it goes in pendulum, it swings, right? Like, so you had the what's it called, the Tea Party. They caught fire for a little bit, and they fizzled out. Who's the?
Yeah.
I mean, this is another surge, maybe, and I do notice it. But it's a pendulum thing, because the philosophy of the country is not liberty. It just goes, kind of swings back and forth, and it's been doing that forever. I mean,
I think it's some bastardized version of liberty, and
Yeah.
it only exists on the right. I mean, I don't see any of it on the left
Yeah, you're
anymore.
right. And anymore. And that's 100% true. I don't think there's any, I think the left has gone authoritarian. And in the 60s, it wasn't. In the 60s, it was anti-establishment. They were for free speech. They weren't economically for liberty. They were always had that, Marxist, leftist, political view. But from a civil liberties point of view, they were more for freedom. But that is gone. Now they're authoritarian, compliant. They've gone toxic, and that's where I think the left is just imploded. And you're right. So the only hope for liberty politically is on the right. But there are some pretty bad elements on the right as well, as you know. So I don't see anything. I mean, the closest thing on the left is a Joe Manchin politically, and Kristen Sinema. Well, they're more Republican than Democrat anyway, but they're outliers.
Absolutely. But we want to at least have our voice in there, so that it's just not these illiberal voices on the right that end up taking over as things get worse, because there's no liberty voice.
Yeah. You can scream from the rooftops, for sure, and it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But there's just so many, there's no consistent philosophy. I'm not a historian, an intellectual historian, but back in the 1700s, the Renaissance period, there was a coherent, consistent movement of true liberty, of the classical liberty sense, where the revolutionaries really caught fire with John Locke's ideas and Adam Smith and all those guys. They brought it to America. There was some coherence there. Today it's fragmented. There is no Lockean Enlightenment movement that has reached the Washington, let's call it, has reached the power centers of America. That is seated only in the Cato Institute or other liberty movements, but it hasn't penetrated. Maybe there's a few who maybe what's his name, Rand Paul, or what's his name one of the congressmen of Kentucky.
Massey.
I can't remember the guy's name.
Thomas Massey.
Maybe no, I don't know him. But in any event, there's maybe a few, but there's no coherent liberty movement in the power centers.
You're right.
So that's a problem.
I think it could be a market. I mean, I think the lesson of a lot of these is that, let's work to sharpen our understanding with others. And that a big role for any of these Ayn Rand groups can be to help build those bridges of communication. I mean, obviously some people that want to hate her are going to hate her anyway, but let's not lose more people to honest misunderstanding.
Yeah. I mean, I love the idea of a second Renaissance. I mean, there used to be like the conference used to be called Second Renaissance, or Second Renaissance books used to be.
Right.
So, and that would work because there's historical context to that. And America was started as a liberty movement, and to reignite that and to really play on that. So it's not some like abstract philosopher, some novelist, Ayn Rand. I wouldn't, she to me completed the picture. She filled in the gaps it was a very political movement, but ethically and metaphysically, epistemologically, there was no foundation. So she filled in those gaps. So what I like to how I conceptualize it is a return to the founding father ethos with, with the gaps filled by objectivism. And that's, a return. So it provides at least people who are not objectivists with some historical context. So I love, like Governor Kristi Noem, and she's a Christian conservative, right? But what I love about her is she's a real constitutionalist. She never locked down at all. Like,
Right.
Even Ron DeSantis locked down for our governor for 2 months. She, on principle, on constitutional grounds, never locked down. And she's a true constitutionalist. And I mean, look, there's contradictions in her views, and that's fine, but we need more politicians who think that way. And I think we can move the needle.
And people in our side of the movement don't have to assume that a libertarian is automatically dishonest, or that a religious Ayn Rand fan is, necessarily an ideological opponent. Like you said, it's contextual.
It is. It really is. And they're good people. These are really good people. And yeah, if your goal is to establish a true limited government, you're going to run into problems for someone who's very religious, because the foundation of liberty is secular. It's not religious, unlike what Ben Shapiro thinks is the case. But there's going to be some friction. But to get some momentum, you should align yourself with good people who at least have a rational frame, like you said, who are at least thinking rationally or on the right track. And I'd rather do that, because if you're just going to be isolationist, like an intellectual isolationist, and just think, well, I'm only going to deal with people who are only objectivists, you're not going to get, like, the revolutionaries didn't do that. Right. I mean, Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton, they hated each other. I mean, they were warring factions, and there was fighting, and it was just, but they all kind of had a common denominator framework. So, if you're going to think there's going to be like harmony, and the schisms don't help. The schisms make it worse. You can't have schisms like that. I mean, there's some justification for some schisms, of course, but if you're not going to tolerate, differences, what I would consider superficial differences, you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah. Keep the hierarchy of values in mind and what's most important, so you're not sacrificing without even meaning to.
Exactly. And even amongst objectivists, there's disagreements. I mean, it's very tough. I mean, when you apply these ideas to new contexts, like, the internet, privacy, freedom of speech, it's not automatic answers.
Absolutely.
We're not John Galt, where we just stand on a pedestal and declare truth. It's very tough. And there'll be valid disagreements among very rational people. And if those disagreements are signals to you that, oh, we can't work together, nothing's going to get done.
The schisms that are ostensibly about the philosophy, but then they don't explain it all or go back and forth and debate it. I think that's really a problem, because then the general audience has no clue what's going on, and there's confusion, and there's misguided allegiances, and people picking sides without even any reasonable basis for it. I think that's the problem, is that they go silent, they don't talk about it, but at the same time they're saying it's this philosophical problem. And
yeah. And, it's very hard from an audience perspective to evaluate, who's on the right side of the schisms, because we're not, party to what's going on in the room. Like, you're not in the room, you don't know what's going on. So all you do is you hear, rumors or or declarations from the aggrieved parties. And it's very hard to evaluate objectively who is who and who is in the right side of things. It's very tough. And I mean, I know there was an article put out by ARI about this, and I read it. It's you know, their position was that, you know, if you shouldn't be just, you know, declaring publicly disputes where your audience can't objectively evaluate them. I think that's fair. On the other hand, though, if there are disputes and well-known people who you respect all of a sudden departing and going their separate ways, there has to be some communication to your audience as to what the hell happened, because we're going to ask those questions. You know, why is the, you know, back in the David Kelly schism, you know, that was a long time ago, but, you know, he was a respected objectivist, wrote a very impressive book, The Evidence of the Senses. He was a top intellectual. And then there was a breakup. Now, I wasn't party to that. I was just an audience member, but because I read his work and I knew about him and I respected him, and all of a sudden there's a schism and a breakup, and there's this, you know, these essays about fact and value and all this. I would like to know more. And it's very, and I'm not saying that I know the answer to this, because I don't, but as an audience member who cares about this movement, how is it, are we supposed to be properly informed to make a judgment? Because
yeah, each schism has an effect on morale, and it didn't seem like they took that into account.
Like a company, when there's a firing in a company of someone who's respected by other coworkers, that's a huge disruption. And there has to be, and management has to make, you know, a declaration and an explanation to the rest of the staff as to what happened. If they keep silent, it's going to cause a morale problem, and it's going to cause a lot of fear. Who's next? Am I next? Am I going to be excommunicated? There has to be some PR, and that's a skill. Like, PR is a skill. Like, you could be a brilliant philosopher and have a real dispute with a fellow philosopher in a movement and go your separate ways. But there has to be some PR effort that is properly done and for the audience. And PR is a skill. There's a profession called PR, you know.
That's good.
Maybe they have bad PR. There's bad PR because it really pissed a lot of people off, and people didn't know. And they went their separate ways. And
yeah, the high point of objectivism may have been early '68 when they were renting space in the Empire State Building.
Yeah. Wow, I didn't know that.
I'd like to quickly tie this back to the idea of the blurred distinctions, because in this article that ARI released on schisms, I noticed there seems to be an attempt to kind of conflate the ideas of an arbitrary assertion versus eyewitness testimony, because they're trying to label Carl Barney's posts or blog posts as arbitrary, but really he's giving his testimony of what he witnessed in these transactions that were going on. And I'm worried and concerned that there's this conflating going on and trying to label testimony as arbitrary, when in some cases all you have is the eyewitness testimony, and that can be valid evidence in presenting a case.
It's a good point. And in a courtroom, the statements by witnesses have to be backed up by evidence, and there's cross-examination, and there's physical evidence, there's verbal testimony. So the audience, in this case is a jury, is able to objectively evaluate the evidence presented. In the case of schisms and articles and posts on social media, they don't have that kind of control. There's no, you know, it's not like a courtroom. So it's very tough to evaluate the veracity of these statements by the opposing parties. It's very tough for us as audience members, because there's no controlled environment like a courtroom or a tribunal. So it's very tough. And you know, someone would argue, well, that's arbitrary because of the lack of structure and the lack of opposing evidence, and therefore you have to write it off as arbitrary. I don't that sounds a bit extreme to me.
It
But
can
I
be an
would,
excuse not to have to answer legitimate charges.
right. So I would characterize it as a piece of evidence if you respect, and if there's true like, so Barney, again, I don't know the ins and outs of the history of, I know he was a massive donor and he was on the board, and he was he's a wealthy guy.
Peikoff still seems to value him.
And there is some of that too. So he's worth listening to, because there's some content. He's not some random guy, right? However, there has to be, there's no controlled form to present this information. Would you call it arbitrary? I would just call it a piece of information that you can't judge until if you choose to judge, you better get more information and much more context to say this is either valid or I'm going to write it off. But to say it's arbitrary right away is if it's some random person saying it, yes, it's arbitrary. But if it's someone who's had a deep relationship with ARI for many, many, many years and knows all the players, I don't think you can just automatically say it's arbitrary, in my view. I think that's epistemologically an error to say that.
Especially if he was involved, if he was there to witness the agreement that ARI made with TAS, or
right,
yeah,
if he's a witness,
TOS.
If he's a witness to the crime, whatever, you have to, okay, he has something to say, but there has to be, in fairness, cross-examination. There has to be, and now is it now incumbent on ARI to defend itself? That's a good question. I think, well, it's a movement, right? And if someone who was a part of this movement in a deep, deep way and well-known makes these allegations, I think it's incumbent on ARI to respond in kind, because it's a movement and it has an audience. And this person was part of that movement. Now, if it was some random or lesser significant person, I would agree, ignore this person, or ARI has too bigger fish to fry. They have limited budget. They have no time to respond to everybody who makes an allegation. But if it's a big fish who makes an allegation, who is part of the movement for many, many years, there has to be some accountability to respond. That's my point of view.
I agree.
That's fair. Well, this has been great. I actually thought we were going to disagree a bit more, but we may have to bring you back for, I have some ideas for legal reform. Maybe we could get you in on. But you offered some great insights. You're very objective when it comes to ARI and what needs to be fixed. William, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Michael, for coming on. It was a pleasure talking to you. Yeah, I think I learned a lot in this discussion, and I hope we can have you back on some other time.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. It was really fun. Be happy to join next time.
Great, appreciate that. Well, this has been the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff, along with William Swig, and we will see you next time.